I am Barbara Parmley, a member of Al-Anon, and it's great to be here. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting Charlie and I. We don't get to travel very much together. Charlie's usually going one direction with his other partner. I don't know if any of you know his other buddy, Joe, but it's quite a privilege for us to get to be together at the same place. The accommodations are great. Your weather, well, it's beautiful inside. You know, since I've been in Al-Anon, I've learned that the outside elements doesn't have to have any effect on how I feel, and I feel good. You know, I like the people, and everybody's made me feel real welcome, and I'm very grateful to Teresa and Lane. They picked us up in Baltimore yesterday, and there was all this sleet and ice, and we have that back home some too, but we had a delightful trip, and they've made me even more comfortable, and I sure appreciate them. Anne, I believe you started us off good. I don't know if she's here now or not, but and those who weren't here last night really missed a fantastic gal. The AA speaker last night, she was really something. She made me grateful again that I'm not an alcoholic. That I just had to marry one to get to work the 12 steps in my life. But you know, I thought again that this is the only fellowship where everyone laughs at all the terrible, horrible things that happen in their life. And then when things start getting good and we start talking about how good things are, we start to cry. And that's the way it usually goes. Well, I'm here because my husband had a compulsion to drink, and I had an obsession to stop him. I looked back over my past after I came into Al-Anon and started taking an inventory, and I found out that I had several other obsessions. I had an obsession to fix. You know, most Al-Anons are fixers. Now, I don't remember that I ever fixed too many things, but I was always trying to fix somebody or something. When I was in the third grade in school, I was the oldest in our family. There were 3 girls. And when I was in the third grade, my mother ran away from home. And there I had these 2 young sisters, and my poor daddy didn't have a wife, and I just felt so sorry for this family, and I was going to have to fix this situation. So I tried to play mother and try to be a good daughter for my father so he wouldn't have to have any problems. He'd had enough with his wife leaving us. So I started right then trying to fix situations. And then my father finally remarried, and we had a stepmother, and she was a good mother. I had a lot of those good, bad things that happened in my life. I know when that happened, I couldn't understand why a mother would leave her children. My little sister was only about a year old, and I just couldn't imagine a woman leaving her children. And I would mention this to my father, and he said, well, they're just some women that way. You know, he never said anything bad about my mother, but, you know, he would kind of just slide over it. And today, when I look back, and I've kept in contact with my mother off and on all these years, and she's had a terrible life. She's had a life almost like Anne's. In fact, she's had some problems. And I thought, you know, God just removed this figure from our lives and brought us a stable stepmother, and we did have a comfortable home and a stable home. So sometimes we never know why, when something's happening today, you know, what the end results will be. But anyway, as I was growing up, I always tried to be a good daughter for my father. You know, I didn't want to create any problems. My goal in life was to grow up and get married and have children and live happily ever after. That's all I ever wanted to do. When I started dating and looking at the boys, well, my father took me to the side and he said, now, Barbara, of course, he knew what my desires were. He said, no one in this family gets married until they graduate from high school. And there's something else that you don't do. He said, nice girls don't do these things, certain things, until they get married. And if you do, the boys write your name on the pool hall bathroom door. So I certainly wasn't going to get my name on the bathroom door. So I hurried up, and as soon as I graduated from high school when I was 18, I hurried up and got married 3 months later, just so I could do what Daddy said I couldn't do until I got married. Now, back in those days, I don't know how, you know, things are different now, but back in the 50s, the early 50s, you just really didn't do those things. So, I was really anxious to do this, and so I did get married, and I believe this boy's father and parents must have told him the same thing, because when we got married, it was nothing what I'd anticipated, and it just went downhill from there. It was really a disappointment. I think maybe the younger generation may be doing things right, I don't know. But after we got married, of course, I knew how you were supposed to do when you got married. It's like in my home. My father was the type of person who went to work, he came home, played with the children, gave mother the check, and it was always the family together, and Daddy was always there with the children and with mother. And this guy, evidently, he just didn't know how to play house. So I kept trying to get him to play house the way you're supposed to play house, but he wanted to do all these other things. He'd like to take his money and he would go do his thing with it. And he was never home with me and the children. And finally, after 3 children, I decided, I just cannot fix this guy. I've been trying for 12 years, 14 years to fix this fella, and he just, you just couldn't fix him. And when you can't fix something, you just discard it and go get you something else. So finally, after 14 years of marriage and 3 children, the youngest about a year and a half, I filed for divorce and proceeded to look for the perfect husband and father for my children. Well, there were several things that he was going to have to be able to do. One was he was going to have to love my children and want to be a good father and stay home and make a home for these children. He'd have to have a good job so that I wouldn't have to work, and I could stay home because I had always worked, and I could stay home and play house like I've always dreamed of doing, and that he would want me for a hobby. Now, what I was really looking for was a rich sex maniac. And at that time, I was working for a state agency in Oklahoma. By the way, we're really from Oklahoma. It just says Arkansas on our tag because that's where we get our mail, is in Arkansas. It's the closest post office box. And our home group is in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, which is at that time the only group near us. We really live in Oklahoma. We are about a mile from the Arkansas line. And we're just about 6 miles from Missouri. So we're sort of right in the, right where 3 states join there. But anyway, at this time I was working for this state agency in Oklahoma that trains students. And Charlie, we sent students to this aeronautical school in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I was always writing letters to this Mr. Charles Parmley, who was the director of admissions to this school. Or I would get this gentleman on the telephone from my boss, and so I knew this voice. And for a couple of years I had seen this name and heard this voice. And finally we were at a convention for this rehabilitation agency, and I finally got to meet Charlie Parmley. He sat at the same banquet table. And in fact, I asked my boss, I said, "Who is that gentleman sitting over there?" And he was a young man at that time. And he told me that was Charles Parmley. Well, I was so surprised because I thought, well, I expected an older man, about like he is today, with the job that he had and all. So I was real surprised at this young man. Well, all through the dinner, I'd be looking at Charlie, and I'd turn over and look at him, and I'd notice he would be looking at me. So after the banquet, we started visiting, and he was so nice, and he was so polite, and he was a real gentleman. And one of my bosses, afterwards we went out and had some drinks and did some dancing, and I just, I really liked this fella. And but my boss told me, he said, "Now, Barbara, Charlie drinks a lot." Well, now I didn't know any more about drinking than I did about sex. And so I thought, well, he didn't act drunk to me, and we did start dating, and Charlie always had a bottle in the glove box or in the trunk of the car, and he never acted drunk. I just thought he was thirsty. I know in our home, growing up as a child, I never remembered alcohol being in the home, except one time the folks had a New Year's Eve party, and there was some mixed drinks. But and then after I got married, we would go out maybe once a month if we'd have a little extra money to go out to dance and have a few drinks. But as a teenager, we would go out and party some. But I never did like the drinking. I didn't like to be around people that got drunk and, they kind of slobbered around, or the girls would always get all messed up, and as Ann was describing last night, And I never did like to be around people that were out of control. And I didn't really like to drink that much, because after I'd drink a little bit, I'd start getting kind of sleepy, and I didn't want to miss out on anything. So alcohol just did not do anything for me. I had a lot more fun. It didn't take alcohol to make me do the things that alcoholics do. And I just, I wondered if you'd catch that. I related some with Ann, only I wasn't drinking. But I have red hair. But I just didn't know anything about alcohol. And like I say, Charlie wasn't drunk, and he wasn't out of control. He was always a perfect gentleman. And I do love to dance. And we would get to go to places where we would have dinner and dance. And I enjoyed that part of I liked the social part that went with drinking. But, who needs to drink at home? You're not going to socialize. But Charlie, the first thing when he'd come in from work, well, I speed it up here a little bit, we finally did get married. We dated a while, and Charlie said that we would, he wanted to know if I would want to get married, and he had some land out here on the Arkansas-Oklahoma line, and he would build us a home, and he would quit this job in Tulsa, where he has all this pressure, and he wouldn't have to drink so much. And that sounded great, because he was doing some, he was drinking more and more, and after we got married there, he was beginning to get drunk. And I couldn't believe this. It just scared me. I can't imagine this man I'd turned my life and will over to. He was my God, and when your God gets drunk, you get scared. So, now I say I had 3 children when Charlie and I married. The oldest was 12. I had a daughter 12, a daughter 10, and a little boy about a year and a half old. My folks were surprised. They couldn't imagine some man marrying me with 3 children. Well, as I look back, he'd have to be drunk to do this. And I'm sure after he would sober up and see what he got into, that probably helped him go back to drinking. And Charlie had been married before, but he didn't have any children. And he couldn't wait to start a family. And, of course, I knew, when he had a child of his own, he probably wouldn't want to drink so much. So we'd been married about 2 months, and I got pregnant, and that's when he decided we were going to go to this farm. I'm going to build a house out on this acreage, and we're going to move to the farm, and that'd be a good place to raise these children. So we commuted from Tulsa to this farm, which is about a 2-hour drive, on weekends, and Charlie would build this home. Now, most people measure their home by board feet. I measured it by 6-packs. We would get to Maysville, and Charlie would send me to the Missouri line to get him a case of beer, and then he would get his lumber from Arkansas at the lumber yard. And he would drink and hammer and saw. Well, we finally got our home completed and moved to the farm. Then I thought, everything's going to be all right. Now, by that time, I'd had this baby. And I had this small baby, and the little boy was about 2.5 by then, and these other 2 children, the older girls. And there we are on this farm, and Charlie, now he doesn't have a job where he has to stay sober, and he's drinking around the clock. And he's doing some strange things. But then we had built, in our area, and around here I've noticed, we raised chickens. And so we had 4 chicken houses, 45,000 broilers we were raising. He had hogs. He started out with 2, and typical alcoholic, we ended up with 20 sows, who all pigged at the same time, so you can imagine how many pigs we would have. And we had cattle. And Charlie would go to feed the hogs, which would be down across the creek a ways, but I had my binoculars where I could watch, because you have to watch him, because he'd say he's going to feed the hogs, and he wouldn't come back for 2 days. And I would be furious when he would come home, and I would meet him at the door with all these accusations, and he would look at me like, "You're crazy, woman." In fact, I used to tell him, I said, "I didn't know I was married to an alcoholic." And he said, "I didn't know I was married to a crazy woman." And when I got to Al-Anon, I found out we were both right. But he would always give me this look like, what are you talking about? Well, after I came into Al-Anon and found out about blackouts and so forth, then I realized he probably didn't know he'd been gone for 2 days. He thought he'd just been down to feed the hogs, and he comes home and his wife's crazy. So I was getting a little upset about this. Finally, I thought, you know, if I could just keep him home where he wouldn't have to go to get the booze, then he wouldn't have to leave. So I'll start making home brew. Now, I'd never made home brew, but I did have a thermometer or a tester that was my grandfather's, that my grandmother had given me just as because it was something of the past. And so I thought, well, I'll just make home brew, and then he won't have to leave. So here I am working off these batches of home brew, and you could smell it when you'd come to the house. And all the other neighbor ladies are canning green beans and sauerkraut, and I'm in there capping home brew. It was powerful stuff. The last batch I made, I bottled it a little green, and it started to explode. It was still sitting on the cabinet in the kitchen. I'll never remember that or forget that. The glass started blowing around the room, and Charlie and I were sitting at the table ducking, and when one blew, it just made all the rest of them blow up. And there was this glass and home brew just spraying all over the kitchen, and I told him, I said, now look at that stuff. Now, see what it's doing in those bottles? Can't you imagine what it's doing inside of you? He didn't pay any attention, but I didn't make any more home brew. I started doing all the things that most Al-Anons do, you know, to keep them from drinking, dumping the bottles, and trying to find out where. Mainly, I was concerned about who he was drinking with. Now, when you're married to a sex maniac, you know what he's probably doing. So I would keep track of the mileage on the vehicles. Now, here we are way out in the country, and we had 3 vehicles. I had an automobile, and he had a car and a pickup. So that keeps you busy. I mean, when you're married to an alcoholic, you are busy. You don't have time to keep house or take care of the children, you know. You are totally, completely obsessed with alcohol. Now, I know there were times when Charlie didn't drink, and he probably wasn't thinking about drinking. But there was never a moment that I wasn't thinking about drinking. You know, even if there was sobriety, I'm thinking about when he's going to do it again. So here I am trying to keep track of the mileage on the vehicles so I can know how far he's going and who he's with. So as soon as he'd leave and he'd come back, I'd run out there and write the mileage down. I kept it on the calendar, and I had the vehicles and all these mileages, and I'm trying to keep track. And if he'd been gone, you know, if he'd go 20 miles, then I would go 20 miles and trying to find out who she is. And I didn't know too many people in the community because we hadn't lived there too long, and it is a small community. Maysville's population about 34, and that's if you count kids and everybody. So I did know a few ladies. And so when Charlie didn't come home at night, I would begin to call these ladies. And the one who wasn't home, she was it. And now when they answered the phone, and at 11:30 at night you're calling and they answer, and you think, now what am I going to say? I'm always thinking, what am I going to say? You know, they're going to think there's something wrong with me if I don't have some good excuse. So I would ask them for a recipe or some dumb thing that would come to my mind. After I got into Al-Anon, I had to make some amends to these ladies. Of course, I couldn't tell them I thought you were running around with my husband. But I did apologize for all the crazy things that I did. And, you know, they just kind of looked at me like they didn't mind that much. You know, they just knew I was kind of squirrely and let it go at that. Well, things were beginning to get worse. And finally, I thought, you know, I just can't stand this any longer. I'm going to have to get these children out of this situation. Now, Charlie, even through all the drinking, was never, ever out of line with my children. You know, he was the good father that I wanted my children to have, and he was home most of the time. And he taught them how to work. When you're living on a farm, everyone gets to work, and the children learned how to work and stay busy on the farm. And he was never out of line with the children. Now, he got out of line with me a few times because I tried to get between him and his bottle, and you just don't do those things. In fact, there was one time I antagonized him to the point where he struck me. And I thought, boy, wait till I tell him about this tomorrow when he sobers up. He is really going to feel bad, you know, that he did this to me. Because, you know, I just knew that he's not that type person. So the next morning I confronted him with what he had done the night before. And he looked at me and he said, I probably should have hit you harder. And so finally I thought, well, I don't think I want to try that again. You know, that's kind of a painful way to teach somebody a lesson. I tried to have him arrested. I thought if I could just get him thrown in jail, that would sober him up. So I thought what I'll do is I'll antagonize him to the point where he'll strike me again, and then I'll call the sheriff and have him arrested, and then he won't drink anymore. So when he came, you know, how Al-Anon's mind's always thinking, I'm planning this, and then he goes, he kind of would have periods where he wouldn't drink. Well, he was on one of these periods where he didn't drink, and I've got this good thing planned, and he's not drinking. So you just keep thinking, waiting for him to get drunk. Will he ever get drunk so I can do this thing and get even with him, you know? So finally, he did get drunk, and I've got this plan now that I've been working on for several weeks in my head. And so he comes home, and I start in on him, saying the same things, and we do talk ugly most of the time when they're drinking. And I called him all these ugly names and told him what I thought, and he didn't strike me. Well, now, good Al-Anon, she can't just waste this plan, you know. So I tore my blouse and messed up my hair and kind of rubbed around my face to make it look red, and then I called the sheriff, which is about 10 miles from where we live. And the sheriff said, well, now, Miss Parmley, they talk a lot slower in my area. He said, now, Charlie doesn't seem to be too bad of a fella. He said, couldn't you and the children just leave tonight and we'll come talk to him tomorrow? Well, now, I told him what I thought about the law enforcement agency in Delaware County. And so I spoiled my blouse, and that didn't work. But I did tell him that they were going to come. The next morning, I did tell him I had called, and he told me, he said, I told you it wouldn't do any good to try to get me arrested, because I had threatened him a time or two with that. And they did come out and talk to Charlie, and they sent a fellow that had been going to AA, and he came out and talked to Charlie, and it didn't seem to have much effect at that time. So finally, after, like I said, I had tried everything that I thought I could, is get even. Finally, I tried some other things. You know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I did some pretty stupid things. I went in Al-Anon with a lot of guilt, you know, because these are things I didn't, in my mind, I didn't want to do it, and yet I could justify doing it. You know, when you're living with an alcoholic, you can justify doing just about anything. Some women have gotten by with murder. You know, after all, you're living with a drunk and he beats you up, you can kill him. And the courts let you off. So I did a lot of things to get even. And then you don't get angry, you just have a lot of guilt. So finally I'd had it. And I thought, I'm going to have to get these children out of this situation. So I tried to find a job so I could leave Charlie. Well, the only type of work I'd ever done was secretarial work, and there was no job available for secretaries in this community where I lived. Like I say, the closest town had a population of 2,000, and there wasn't. And another town not too far had a population of 600. So finally, I'd gone to this poultry plant. There's several poultry plants in almost every town, processing plants. So I went in this processing plant to apply for a job in the office, and they didn't have an office opening, but they did have one on the line. Now, I don't know if anyone here has ever been in a poultry processing plant, but at that time, they did have an opening on the giblet table where you sack these giblets and then you poke them in the chicken. So I thought, I'll do anything. I've got to get some money so I can leave this fellow. And then I was too proud to take his money. And so I tried poking these giblets for about 3 weeks, thinking, oh, God, if he'll only sober up now and tell me to quit this job. And he always said he didn't want me to work. And I was, I thought, and he didn't even know I was leaving early in the morning with these children. And after I did that a while, I realized, boy, I don't think I want to do this. I think I better just stay with that drunk. So finally, Charlie did sober up and realized what I was doing and told me I shouldn't be doing that and I better stay home. So I came back home and tried a little longer. And finally, again, I'd had about all I could stand, so I thought, I'm just going to have to file for divorce and go on welfare, I guess. So I went to an attorney, applied for a divorce, and of course the law, I knew I would need some money to live on, and I went to the bank and I got what money we had and put it in my name. And Charlie will tell you this when he tells his story tomorrow. But so then I came home and told Charlie that I had filed for this divorce, and you know how we are. We just want him to say they'll quit drinking. And he promised me he'd quit drinking if I'd drop the divorce. And that's all I wanted. I had feelings for Charlie. You can't hate something that you don't love. Indifference is the bad part. But I wasn't indifferent. You can't hate somebody if you don't love them. And I didn't want to leave Charlie. I just wanted to get away from this alcohol. So when he promised me he'd quit drinking, that's all I wanted to hear. So I was too embarrassed to go back to the lawyer. Now, I told that lawyer what a no-good bum he was, and I thought, that lawyer would think I was crazy. After telling him all these bad things and then say I didn't want a divorce, that I wanted to live with him. So I just called him on the telephone and told him that I thought we could work it out and to drop the divorce. When I had to pay half. I spent more on divorces than Charlie did on alcohol. So he stayed sober for a while. And then pretty soon he started drinking again. It started getting bad. Well, I found out what worked. You just go see a lawyer. When I was too embarrassed to go back to the second lawyer, I was beginning to do things that were embarrassing to me. I'd think, what are people going to think? But I'd do it anyway. And so I went on back to another lawyer, and I filed for divorce, told him what a rotten drunk he was. And I came home and told Charlie, and you know what? He said the magic words, I'll quit drinking. And, of course, I believed him and called the lawyer, too embarrassed to go back. And my sister had been coming to visit us from Tulsa, and she knew there was a problem in the home. And she had brought me some literature, some AA literature and some Al-Anon literature. Well, I'd never heard of Al-Anon. I'd heard of alcoholics. I'd worked in a mental hospital for a while, and I saw the word alcoholic on some of these patients. And that's where alcoholics were, locked up in a mental hospital. So, but I'd never heard of Al-Anon. And I read that Al-Anon literature, and it said, that they had a disease and to treat them with kindness and with respect and dignity. And I thought, baloney, you don't fix things by just leaving it alone. I've never had anything change or be fixed by just leaving it alone. So I just set that to the side, but I read that AA literature, and I thought, yep, that's Charlie all right. And so anyway, and they gave me a contact in Silent Springs, Arkansas, an Al-Anon I could contact if I ever wanted to. Well, there was, I still thought I could probably handle the situation or fix it. So anyway, I had filed for the second divorce, and things were rocking along pretty good. And finally, he started drinking again. And I thought, this time, I'm gonna get out of this situation. I had remembered singing that piece of Al-Anon literature. It says, when you make a decision, stick to it. And I hadn't been sticking to any decisions. So I went to before I filed for this third divorce, I did go to Al-Anon. I have to catch my story here. I was, of course, thinking about getting another divorce, and I thought, anybody that miserable, and by that time Charlie wasn't even leaving home to drink. He'd leave home just long enough to get a bottle and come back. He'd pass out in the chicken houses, and he was just drinking around the clock. So I thought, anybody that miserable, somebody ought to just put him out of their misery. So I thought maybe I could help him along a little. And I was laying on the bed thinking how I could asphyxiate him when he comes in and passes out in the pickup and probably get by with it. And I thought, my God, what has happened to me? I am really, I'm going to lose my mind if I don't do something for me. That's a terrible thing to plan somebody's murder. So I made contact with Al-Anon. I thought, I've got to find some help for Barbara. And I went over and talked to this lady, and what she said? She said, I understand how you feel. And nobody understood how I felt. My parents, I could tell them how bad Charlie was. I said, Barbara, he's not really that bad. And of course, they were probably afraid I was coming home with 4 children. Or I'd complain to my girlfriends or people in the community, and they'd all say, oh, he's not that bad. Well, they don't act that bad out in public. But boy, they're the dickens when they're home. And besides, you get kind of lonely living with a drunk. I don't think there's anything lonelier than living with a drunk. Living alone, at least you can go out and do something, but when there's somebody there, and yet they aren't there, it's a very lonely feeling. So, anyway, this gal said she understood, and she told me about a meeting on Friday night, but she wouldn't be there. she wouldn't be there, but she gave me contact of another lady that lived in another area, and she worked at another poultry company, and for me to go by and see her, and she would take me to my first meeting. Well, I went home with some hope. Finally, somebody understands. And I made contact with the lady in this other town that works at a poultry company, and she is my sponsor today. And we made plans to go to meeting on that Friday night. Now, that was the first part of the week. During the Monday and the Friday, Charlie and I got in another discussion, and I decided this time I am leaving. I am not going to put up with this anymore. And like I said, I read that literature and it says make a decision, stick to it. And this time I went to the third lawyer. I filed. I came home and I told him. And the sheriff served him the papers and he had to leave the home. I followed through with it. So the little gal called me on about Thursday to see if I was going to be going to the meeting. Something. I had no idea, what Al-Anon was or why she was so adamant about getting me to this meeting. So finally I thought, well, if it'll help her out, I'll go. So I did meet her, and as we rode to the meeting that night, I was telling her husband about how I can't understand these alcoholics. Charlie would just disappear and not come home for a day or two, and he'd say, well, there were times when I would be out on the road just drinking, and I would pass out, and he said I'd wake up, and I didn't know for sure where I was. I just have to stay there till daylight to find my way home. And I thought, that might be what happened to Charlie. So I got to the meeting, and they told me on new members, we always spend a few moments telling them about the disease of alcoholism. That the alcoholic doesn't do this because he doesn't love you. He has a disease, and he has a compulsion to drink, and he has no choice. And so I thought, well, if that's what's really wrong with Charlie, maybe I ought to try a little bit harder. This was my second marriage. Maybe I ought to take these marriage vows a little more serious. And I remember I asked this one thing. I said, but how do you know when he's lying? You just can't ever tell that. They're always lying to you. How do you know? And she says, well, is his mouth moving? And then I thought, well. So anyway, I came home and I called Charlie and I said, I think I know what the problem is. If you'd like to come home, you could come home. Of course, now this was the home that Charlie built, and he did love his children. And so he came home and he continued to drink, and I continued to go to Al-Anon. And now, when an alcoholic's drinking, he doesn't like you to go to Al-Anon. Or anyway, Charlie didn't. He was so afraid that the community would think he may have a drinking problem if they found out I was going to Al-Anon. Well, he didn't know. I'd already told everybody, that he was a drunk. After all, you have to tell them because you're doing strange things and they're going to wonder about you. When you're sitting out on the road at 2 in the morning and there's coon hunters going up and down the road seeing you sitting there just parked and their windows kind of steamed up, or sometimes weather like this and it's cold and there's frost on the inside of the windows, they're going to wonder what you're doing, so you have to let people in the community know, that you're married to an alcoholic. I would do this, you got to get even. So when he goes out and stays all night, I think that's, I'll try that. So I would go out and I'd park down the road so he would wonder where I was. And I'd try to get, I'd leave before he could, so he'd have to stay there with the children and then wonder and worry about where I was. And of course, you know what happens. You come home, they've been drunk and passed out all the time, didn't even know you were gone. But you do all these things, and people see you doing these strange things, so you have to tell them why you're doing this. And anyway, Charlie, he was so afraid that the people in the community was going to know about his drinking problem if I was going to Al-Anon. But I kept on going. Maybe back here I was going because he didn't want me to. If he tells me not to do so, I have to watch that today. When he says you can't do that, I have to do it. There's just something about that. When somebody tells you can't or you shouldn't, well, it's like, but thou shalt not. Those 10 thou shalt nots, and they, I wonder why we can't do it, So you try it to see why. And you prove it to yourself why you can't. But anyway, I continued to go to Al-Anon, and they were beginning to tell me these things like, are you the kind of person that you'd want to come home to? And I said, well, yeah, I would be if he was nice. And they said, that's not the way it is. You were going to have to change. And I said, but there's nothing wrong with me. I would be sweet and lovable. I was until he started doing these things. And they'd say, in fact, I learned how to love, what real love was in Al-Anon. You have to be loving even though you're not, the people are not lovable. And there's nothing more unlovable than an alcoholic. And who needs to love more than an alcoholic does? And I'm not talking about the passion love. You know, I always had love and mixed up within heat. That was the problem I had in my first marriage. I didn't know the difference. But I know they'd say, you know, I came for 3 or 4 weeks, and I'd been trying to start being a little bit more, a little bit kinder to Charlie. And I'd say, it doesn't work. You know, I've been nice for 3 weeks. His drinking's worse. And they'd say, now, Barbara, you're going to have to change. You're going to have to change what you're doing. They'd say, you keep on doing what you've always been doing, and you're going to keep on getting what you've always been getting. And, you know, that's what we'd been on, this merry-go-round. And we have our pamphlets, you know, merry-go-round called denial. You know, neither one of us would get off. You know, he did this, act and react. So I kept on trying to do what they told me to do, and I didn't like it one bit, you know, because I wasn't getting any feedback. And then they wanted me to turn my life and will over to God. Well, now, you know, when you've been fixing things or trying to fix things all your life, it's not easy just to give up. And I can remember as a child growing up, and I've taught my children this prayer, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Well, now that tells me that when I go to sleep, God take care of me, because I'm not alert enough to know what's going on. But when I'm awake, I'm back in control. And, you know, God's only for you to call on when you are asleep or in a dire or just drowning or something like that. But other than that, He's given me this brilliant mind to take care of myself and everybody around me. And so I had to give up, you know, and begin to let God work in my life. And I just knew that when I turned Charlie over to God, he'd probably die, you know, but I had to turn him loose and give him to God. So I started getting a little better, and Charlie finally got into AA. He sloshed around there first year. This was I started in 1968, and Charlie, he came in and tried a few off and on times there during 68, but finally in 69 he did start his sobriety. And we started going to meetings together. Things were going pretty good, and I thought, you know, I'd been working the program enough, and I had worked the steps, but I still thought, I hadn't really made amends to Charlie. So one night we were coming home from a meeting, and I thought, he's really trying, and he deserves an amend. So I was going to say, I'm sorry, I was this way, and then he's going to tell me he's sorry, and everything, I'll give him the opportunity to make his amends to me. So we were coming home, and I said, Charlie, I really did treat you pretty tacky while you were drinking, and I'm sorry, and I want to apologize for my behavior. And it was quiet. I gave him time then to reply and tell me he was sorry, and he said, you damn well should be. And I went back to my sponsor and told her, and she said, well, that's when you make an amend, you don't always get back what you think you want to get back. But that's kind of like our first few years of sobriety were. I'm telling you, that was pure hell. Drinking, what the problem is, but when there's sobriety, it's very uncomfortable. We were two people straining to change because it was not easy for either one of us. We were trying to learn to live a different way of life, and it's not easy. I always relate it with changing my hairstyle. If you ever want to change your hair, if you've been used to parting it on one side and you're going to part it the other way, it keeps wanting to flop back the old way, and it hurts. The roots of your hair are sore and tender because you're pushing them a different direction. And it's hard and it's painful to change, to keep your mouth shut when you want to say something like you're used to saying. But finally, after you get it changed, it just automatically goes this way that you've changed it to, and then it's hard to go back the other way. So that's the way it was working the steps with me and trying to change the way I live. It got easier, and I was more comfortable with doing the things I ought to do. And so here we are. We both got active in service, and I was doing all the things that I felt that God would want me to do. I had turned my life well over to Him and Al-Anon, and anything that, as Shirley pointed out, if they asked me to do anything, I'd say okay. I served in every office there was to serve, and to serve in Arkansas, it's pretty hard because in our state you cannot drive across the state. You either go way up or way down to get across it because of the mountains and so forth. So I did everything they told me to do. Now our children were growing up. The three older children had gone off to college, gotten married, and we still had the baby. I call her our baby. Charlie and I's child at home, beautiful little blonde-haired girl. And she turned about, I guess when she was about 12. She was one night she's laying on the bed, and she'd been over to some neighbor's house where they'd had a party, and she'd been drinking some stuff there, and she kind of liked the taste of it. And she was telling me about it, and I said, oh, Charlotte, don't fool with that stuff, honey. it could be hereditary. You know, this disease of alcoholism. It's been proven that it could be hereditary, and you could have inherited this allergy to alcohol from your father. It's just like any other weakness in your genes or whatever that can be inherited. And she said, "Oh, Mother, if I ever got as bad as Daddy, I wouldn't drink." And that's 12 and 13 years old. She didn't remember her father drinking. She was probably about 3 when he quit. But the 2 younger children especially were raised in the fellowship. You know, they've gone to conventions, we've drug them to meetings, they've been just saturated with AA and Al-Anon. We didn't have Alateen in our area, but they were saturated with Al-Anon and AA. So the girl started having some problems at school. She'd been a straight A student, and she started bringing home lower grades. I found some notes laying one time and some things she'd been doing. We got a call one night anonymously at 12 o'clock at night saying, "Did you know that your daughter was leaving in the middle of the night and coming back home later?" And so we went to her room, and sure enough, she wasn't in her bedroom. We didn't even know she'd been leaving. And it's funny, we went out searching this daughter on the same roads that I used to look for Charlie on. You talk about history repeating itself. So she was beginning to do some strange things. And about that time, this Carol Burnett article came out and says, "Do you know what your children are doing? You better find out." So I started searching her room, and I was finding these funny little things that I'd never seen before, little pipes. And one time I was planting some tomato seeds to start some tomato plants for our garden, and she wanted some of my seeds. She said, "Mother, I'd like to grow some plants in my window in her room." So I gave her some seeds, and when her seeds came up, they didn't look anything like my plants. And I said, "Charlotte, if that's what I think it is, get it out of this house." So she would disappear with it. Well, she finally, when she turned 15, I quit my job. You know, a good fixer. All of a sudden, Al-Anon just went out the door. You know, I panicked. I've got to save this child. I was reading these notes and things she was doing. I was making traps, putting strings across her door with things that would fall, so I'd know when she left the room, because it was so quiet, I wouldn't always hear her. And trying to fix the window, so she was always going out the bedroom window. And I was laying up fixing all these traps. My mind was beginning to be totally obsessed with this child. And I knew it, what I was doing, and I knew I shouldn't be doing it, but I couldn't stop it. And I'd go to meetings, and they'd say, "Barbara, you've got to detach." I said, "How do you detach from something you haven't finished raising?" You know, the law says we're morally responsible for these children. They say we're legally responsible. God says I'm morally responsible. How do we detach from something you haven't finished raising? They said, "You're going to have to do it." So I quit my job, and I came home, and I watched her around the clock. And you know what happened? The same thing that happened with the alcoholic. The wall came up. She became very hostile. There was no more of this closeness at all between us. And finally I realized what I was doing, and I told her, I said, "Charlotte, I'm sorry." You know, and I took her down to catch the bus one morning, and we were sitting there, and I said, "I'm going to have to set you free. There may be some things in your life you're going to have to do that's going to be painful, and I'm going to have to set you free to experience, just like your father. And I apologize for the way I've acted, and I'll never go back in your bedroom again." And you could just see this relief come across her face, and we began to be friends again. Now, she was still doing some pretty strange things, and like I say, I didn't know any more about the effects of drugs than I did about booze or sex. You know, she would tell me a week later, you know, I was stoned when I came home from school the other day. Well, I don't know what stone looks like or acts like. I don't even know what pot smells like, because I'd never smelled it. Now, I could tell you how many drinks Charlie had had and what brand, but I sure couldn't tell you anything about pot or whatever else. I'd seen some notes on these things she described, and I'd never even heard of such things. But so I quit this job, and I was staying home with her and turned her loose. And during the summer when school was out, I went in to call her for breakfast, and she wasn't there. She had run away from home, and that's when she was between 14 and 15 years old. And we just couldn't believe it. And I thought, well, maybe she was down the creek. Some of the kids had their pot parties down the creek in our area, and they were all down there, and she just didn't make it home, and she'd slipped out the night before. We went down there, and there was no one there. So we went to the sheriff and did all the things that you're supposed to do to find a runaway child. And we just couldn't find her. Finally, a week went by. And I remember during that week, I kept saying, "God, if this is what I get for being a good Al-Anon and doing, you know, turning my life and will over to you, I don't want any part of you anymore. There's only one thing that could have ever hurt me, and that was for somebody to do something to one of my children. For some reason, probably it goes back to where my mother left us as a child, but I was always, my children were my possessions, and I thought, they were just so important to me, and they will always know that I love them more than anything else, and I was too possessive as a mother, probably. But I thought, there's only one way that anything could ever hurt me, and that would be through my children. And of course, of all the things that were going through my mind that could be happening to this child, all these things you read about and hear about, and of course, typical Al-Anon, I'm thinking of all the horrible things. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, remember how I used to think about the terrible things Charlie was doing? And he was out, he wasn't in a car wreck, or he wasn't doing these terrible things. He's probably having a ball somewhere, and I think she's probably having a ball somewhere. And for every once in a while, that good thought would come through my mind, And then I knew, it dawned on me that it's like God said, Barbara, I don't punish you, and I don't reward you. If you do what you're supposed to be doing and do my will, you're going to feel good, and if you don't, you're going to feel bad. It's up to you. So I knew that God wasn't punishing me. But I told him, I said, listen, if I'm going to have to get through this, you're going to have to give me more strength than I've got today. And I really know today about the power of God. He gave me the strength to keep on keeping on until Charlotte was found. And she didn't want to come home. The juvenile authorities had found her in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and picked her up and put her in jail and fingerprinted. To her, it's just kind of a lark. And she was decided she wanted to go to a Baptist children's home where she was put for a year. And she would come home and spend some time with us. And it was okay. She was doing what she wanted to do. Great con artist. I've never known an alcoholic yet that wasn't a great con artist. And she could just con these other people. Well, we had enough of Al-Anon and AA to know, you don't change the rules to fit the people. People have to change to fit the rules. Just like in AA and Al-Anon, I've always been looking for a program that would suit me so that I didn't have to change. But in AA and Al-Anon, if you want to have peace and serenity, you have to change to fit the steps. So she kind of conned them along, and finally, after the year was up, she decided she'd come home. Well, she tried that, and that didn't work, and she ran away again. She's been in and out of institutions and places since she was 14 years old. But we still had a good relationship. I could just love her warts and all. I hurt for her, and today, finally, when she was 16, the courts did give us custody back, and Charlie asked her, he said, Charlotte, what do you want to do? And she says, I want to be free. And he said, well, you're 16, maybe you can make it on your own. He said, I'll tell you what you do. You can do what you need to do, but call me every 2 weeks and let me know you're okay. Call me collect, because the court says I'm legally responsible, and they think you're living at home. And I'll tell you what, if they find out this teenager isn't living at home, they will appoint them a guardian, and they'll lock them up somewhere. And she knew that. But in fact, I told her, I said, Charlotte, you've been trying to be free for 3 years, and you've been locked up all this time. So anyway, she takes off, and she finds her friend, and she goes to Tahoe, and she lived there till she was 18. And a year ago, February, by golly, it's been a year, she called us, and she said, Mom, I think I'm ready to come home, if I can come home. Just I think I've had all this stuff I want, and I want to come home. And she came home. She got her a job. She's a beautiful young lady. About a month ago, her father walked her down the aisle. The most beautiful bride you ever saw. She's doing okay. Of course, I told her, I said, that you probably can't drink. She still likes to fool with that stuff, but it's not a problem to her yet. But she's trying to do, and live the kind of life that she's supposed to be living. And we have a great relationship. About a year ago, 2 years ago now, time goes so fast I forget, I had eye surgery. I've had cataracts since birth, and I've never had, I can tell colors, red and blue and green and so forth, but they told me when I had this eye surgery and had these cataracts removed that the first thing I'd notice would be the difference in colors. So after I had my eye surgery, it was in the spring, and I took off the patch, and I couldn't believe how beautiful. I had some red flowers on the porch, and I had never known what red was. I didn't know I couldn't see until I saw. And I was just amazed. I'd keep covering up the good eye, and then I'd look again. I couldn't believe what I had been seeing. You know, things were so faded and distorted as far as colors. And I thought, you know, that's the way I was before I came to Al-Anon. You know, everything was, what I saw was the truth at that time, because what was happening was, I thought was real. And it wasn't real. You know, these things are happening in the way they're supposed to be happening, and it's not all bad. You know, most of the time for something good to come out of it, you have to go through some pain. And so I was seeing things in a distorted way. If Charlie's drinking, if I had taken a movie of our life at that time, you saw this drunk come home, and he'd been making a living for his family. You know, he tried to treat us decent. He'd have probably been a pretty good husband if I didn't keep saying, "You're drunk and don't touch me," or trying to punish him by not talking to him when he was sober. But the wife, you know, I was the one doing a lot of the crazy things and doing most of the abuse to the children, the verbal abuse. I was the one that was always talking ugly to them because I was angry at Charlie. This anger I used it on my children. So, you know, that's how I was seeing life. I never was seeing it the way it really was. You know, and through the 12 steps and the way I live today, you know, I can see life the way it really is. I had the other eye operated on last year. And today, you know, I told Charlie, I said, you know, now I see things like they really are. And I'll never be able to go back and see them the way they used to be because the cataracts have been removed. And that's the way it is with this program. After you've had a spiritual awakening, things will always be different to you. You can never go back. You know, it will cause you pain when you go back. You know I can never change what's going on out here, but I can sure change how I look at it. And that's what's important. You know, how I see it is not always how it is. One day I was sitting in an airport and I saw this lady way down in front of me and she was doing this. And I thought, well, she must have some type of palsy or something. And I was getting this feeling of compassion and bless her heart and isn't that pitiful and all this. And pretty soon she takes something up and she shakes it. She'd been doing some kind of a knitting stitch or crocheting or whatever and doing this, you know. And I thought, you know, that's how I was with Charlie. You know, instead of seeing him as a sick person, I saw him as a no-good bum, and that's how I treated him. And when I started looking at him as a sick person, my attitude started changing. So I had to start changing how I saw things, and that has to come from the inside. And thank God we've got the 12 steps to help us do that. I want to thank you again for inviting Charlie and I here, and I'm looking forward to the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for sharing. We'd like to present you this little token for you to take back to Arkansas in remembrance of your visit with us here in Ocean City. The Seaside Choir will meet right after this in, in the Delaware Room. If you'd like to sing, they'd love to have you, so just stop in. Okay, we'll close in the usual manner. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespass, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.